She trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms. That was how the house learned her weight. An impression left in the mattress, a constellation of breath against warmed sheets. Two bodies calibrated into a single easy rhythm. The gift arrived the way luxury prefers to arrive. Unasked for, perfectly timed, wrapped in intention. A key slipped into her hand over coffee. An estate agent's soft brochure left on the counter. A cedar-scented box placed on the foyer table with a single unnamed card inside. The living room was designed to answer to names. The lamps nodded in sympathetic arcs. The curtains fell in rehearsed pleats. Ivy liked the way light pooled on the floorboards, how the room suggested but never demanded use. It felt like mercy. Space as recovery. A careful architecture that smoothed whatever raggedness had preceded it. Sean had chosen the house the way he chose everything. With a practiced smile, and the attentiveness of someone who had been watched, and had learned which angles pleased onlookers. He moved through rooms as if through an audience, arranging cushions, nudging books into pleasing asymmetry, laughing at stories with a precision that never misread the moment. He carried a cedar scent in his skin, not like a perfume but like a signature, an almost libation he left on the air when he entered. It clung to the back of Ivy's throat when he embraced her, as if he had pressed a small piece of the house into her palm. You could have said later that the gift was also a bargain. But at the beginning, bargains were invisible. There was the ease of silk on skin, the quiet of a house that had been scrubbed of ordinary complaints. There were dinners that arrived on gleaming plates. There were evenings in which a tray of candles turned a hallway into a solemn procession. Ivy took pleasure the way one takes a necessary breath after a long swim. Grateful, slightly stunned, careful about the exactness of each intake. She catalogued small kindnesses as if they were talismans. The thermos Kem had given her when she first moved in, scuffed stainless, its screw-top lid dented where he had dropped it into the trunk of his car, stayed in the kitchen cabinet, and became a domestic proof of fidelity. Kem arrived with practical gifts, an extra set of keys that fit the deadbolt, a phone cable long enough to trail from the bed to the nightstand, a flashlight he kept in the glove compartment. He texted in clipped sentences and showed up with stew and a blunt opinion. "You're not an ornament," he said the first week, leaning on the counter while steam fogged his glasses. He had been friends with Ivy long enough to resent the idea that care could be performed in polished gestures alone. Ivy's mother called less often, but with a steadier seriousness. Her voice carried the housework of a woman who had learned to treat life as a ledger. "Don't sleep through signs," she said once, as if thrift and caution were twins. She sent a box with lavender sachets and a note. "Keep the lamps on when you go to bed." A cautionary litany. Ivy put the sachets into drawers and kept the lamps lit, not out of fear so much as habit. A small discipline to ward the house's many polite shadows. She began, almost without noticing, to list things in her head. 3 lamps that could be left on, a thermos in the kitchen, a cedar box in the foyer, the 2 keys that now fit the lock. She counted nights. She learned to sleep with a lamp. If the house was a promise, small misalignments arrived like fine dust on glass. They were the sort of things that could be explained away with a breath. A camera file that blinked to white for a second at the precise moment of movement. A photograph printed with a soft gray smear along the lower edge. A cushion that seemed to hold an indentation when no one had sat there. At first Ivy tolerated them with the same indulgence she gave to minor eccentricities in friends. The absent phrase, the forgetful detail. People are inexact, devices fail. Sometimes shadows fall where they ought not. Sometimes a scent remains after a person has left, the way cedar stayed at the back of her throat long after Sean had gone. She began to notice a cadence. The cedar would arrive. Then an odd silence around the edges of recorded sound. The cam on the hall would catch nothing but a wash of white exactly when the living room would have held motion. A photograph from a party printed cheerfully, everyone smiling, and in the corner a smudge of darker gray that neither the printer nor a running finger could erase. Once, when she replayed a clip on her phone, the audio engaged in a peculiar theft. Laughter without the breath of footsteps. A glass clinking that did not correspond to any visible movement. The images folded over themselves like pages that refused to lie flat. Ivy learned to catalog. She wrote small, declarative lines in a leather notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She made lists in the margins of her life. Lamps, thermos, cedar box, 2 keys, 1 button found on the threshold. She began recording times in the way one keeps a log at sea. The writing made her feel practical again. It made her feel as if there were a place where the world could be arranged to answer to her questions. There was a moment, not dramatic but precise, when the imbalances shifted from being curiosities to being accusations. It was an evening when Sean had stayed late at a benefit and returned smelling of cedar and champagne, his cufflinks still soft with the light of flashbulbs. He piled flowers on her kitchen counter like a small apology, white anemones balanced against the dark of their stems. He was effusive and composed, and, the next morning, inexplicably more practiced in his attentions. Ivy had the sense, then, of being chosen for the way one is chosen for a photograph, selected for the composition. It was intoxicating and faintly terrible. The first time she saw something that could not be smoothed away by an explanation, it was small and patient and almost deliberate. She had been straightening the living room, arranging the shoes by the mantel, turning a lamp until the light softened the painting, and the couch gave a shadow of an edge she hadn't expected. Beneath its low skirt, something moved. A line, a curve, an undulation that did not belong to fabric. She crouched, heart steadying, and the room smelled suddenly stronger of cedar. No, not just cedar. Cedar connived with a cool mineral scent, like stone left under a stream. The movement drew itself along the floor with an assurance that suggested practice. It was not fast. It was aware. Ivy, reached for her phone the way one reaches for a witness. She angled the screen, fingers protesting with the sluggishness of cold. Light on glass, saturation rising. She tapped the record button and saw the image on the small lit rectangle. The underside of the couch. The abyss of shadow. The point at which fabric met floor. For a breath, she thought she might have secured what she suspected. That finally, the ledger would have a clean line to give to reality. At the exact second, the form emerged into view, the recorded image keyed to white. Not a smudge or a blur. A hard, honest white that replaced motion with blankness. Her screen did not lag. Her phone did not stutter. The world had chosen a white blink of nothing, right at the moment truth would have claimed its shape. She lowered the phone and could not tell at first whether rage or an animal loneliness came first. Sean appeared in the doorway like a tranquilizer, composed, palms empty, a smile that smoothed the furrow of unease. "What happened?" he asked, genuine but perfectly modulated. "Are you all right?" She held out the phone. There was the white rectangle as if the device had a fever and had decided not to tell its owner what it saw. "Try it again," he said, in that voice that made you feel ridiculous for expecting the world to be other than it was. He touched her shoulder as if comfort were a correction. He suggested solutions that required little of him. Check the battery, delete an app. Perhaps she had brushed the lens. He was immediate in his fixes and graceful in his dismissal, offering alternatives the way someone skilled at consolation will always offer alternatives that demand the smallest sacrifice. That night he smoothed the sheets again, arranging them deliberately with a hand that knew angles. He laughed with friends on his phone, sent smiling selfies from his press table, curated his movements as if to show that there was no discrepancy to note. He wore pleasure like armor and invited others to admire how it caught light. Ivy started to share her lists. She told Kem about the blank frames and the photograph smudge, about the cedar that seemed to linger like punctuation at the edges of conversations. Kem listened the way a man accustomed to utility listened. Pragmatic, with a tilt of skepticism shaded by loyalty. "Bring your gear over," he said. "I'll set up a camera with a battery backup. We'll run a loop overnight." He arrived the next day with a small shoulder bag, the thermos clunking against the side. He placed a camera on a tripod in the living room and fixed it toward the couch, the lens at the exact angle Ivy had failed to seize. He tested it, his movements efficient and sufficient. "We'll get a decent file," he said. Before Kem left, Ivy's mother called. "You don't have to prove anything to belong to anyone," she said, as if the very act of protest might cost something in credit. It sounded like an inventory. Keep the lamps on, keep your evidence close, keep your appetite for spectacles small. She told Ivy to take care or to leave, depending on what care could mean. Ivy thought about leaving like a rehearsal for courage. She thought about packing a bag and the exact items that would carry identity. Passports, a sweater, a small cedar box with the button she had found on the threshold. She did not pack that night. She put the cedar box under the mirror instead, tracing its edge with a fingertip until the lacquer warmed. The camera stood. They watched the footage the following morning. Kem sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes narrowed. He had a hand that could fold itself into problem-solving, the way his fingers could assemble a moving part. Ivy sat with the thermos between her hands, the metal still warm from the hot coffee he had poured for her. The clip began with nothing. The couch like a sleeping animal, the hall a line of predictable, polite light. At the moment something would have moved, the frame shifted to white. "It blinks," Kem said, as if the word explained anything at all. He rewound the footage. He peered at the metadata. No signal loss in the feed. No intentional corruption. It's like the sensor chose to refuse. He had the technical vocabulary of someone who repaired things for money, but the way he said it made the defect feel like a misbehavior more than a mechanical error. Sean was not there to witness the failure. He was present in other ways, in messages that slid across her phone, short, charming notes inviting her to a late brunch he was hosting, asking after her sleep, coyly misdirecting. He was visible in photographs that surfaced of him at openings, smiling at donors, catching a laugh with the mayor. Every public image was an exercise in incomprehension. Charm that refracted so easily into a narrative people preferred. In these images, his presence fixed the frame into something neat. His attachments seemed to perform a social levitation, rising above ambiguity like a pleated sleeve. "You should go to the police," Kem said finally, as if the act of speaking might render the problem more manageable. "Make a report. If nothing else, it's something on record." Ivy thought of the list she kept in the back of the leather notebook and imagined a line item. Police report filed. Date, time, officer's name. It felt, in that moment, tidy. She thought about how the community liked tidy lists, how institutions liked to fold messy incidents into categories. She had not yet decided that she needed an institution to tell the truth for her. Institutions she knew preferred narratives that could be smoothed. They liked stories with edges. She called the security firm contracted by the building. A man with clipped vowels came and adjusted cameras with a professional calm. He nodded at the recordings and said the right things about file corruption. He offered to upgrade hardware for a fee. When she asked whether he had ever seen a file that turned white at the very moment of movement, he suggested a power surge, an event that demanded the smallest loss. He smelled faintly of cologne and ozone, the air of someone used to being believed. Meanwhile, small things continued to drift into and out of place in the house. A gray button she had found on the threshold of a party the first week reappeared on the kitchen table when she had been sure it had been placed in the cedar box. It vanished again before Kem could bag it. Shoes she lined up by the mantel would be angled differently in the morning, even though no one admitted to moving them. Mirrors reflected a woman adjusting a lamp and, for a breath, showed her fingers in a slightly delayed position, as if time were an afterimage. She began to notice how social life braided over the loose threads she tried to pull. Sean hosted a small garden party, a precedent of discreet abundance. A man she had known only as a presence in curated photographs, and as the provider of a house that smelled of cedar, now turned his charm into a public operation. He laughed in a way that made neighbors relax their skepticism. He toasted donors and placed his hand on the small of women's backs with a courtesy that read as attentive. At the party, people leaned toward him with an appetite for pleasantness. Conversations slid off the edges of what might be considered dangerous because it was easier to be companionable than to interrogate. A photographer took pictures that afternoon and sent Ivy a file later. Her own face in the image bore the tired gravity of someone who had been cataloging anomalies for weeks. Deshawn smiled from the frame, his teeth bright, his jacket impeccable. An image of someone who had chosen to be loved in order to be unassailable. The photographer's file, when she opened it, showed a soft blur where the couch should have been pointed to the garden, a gray scarf of nothing that the image's software washed into an unremarkable smudge. People called it an aesthetic choice. Ivy learned the precise tone of polite disbelief. She learned the way people would smile and then look away, as if the act of sustained attention might force them into complicity. She learned the social calculus of not asking too many questions in a room where reputations were currency. Some nights she woke and counted the lamps, her fingers tracing the light switches like a ritual. She found herself keeping a cedar box under the mirror, the box closed with the small button wrapped in tissue inside. She kept the thermometer of that small ritual as if it were a liturgy. Open, touch the button, smell the cedar, close. She found seams of comfort in the ritual, and a kind of clarity in the attention. She learned to angle the mirror in the hallway so that the reflection of the living room could be seen from the kitchen. She left a lamp on near the doorway so that shadows would have less to conspire with. She took to arranging shoes deliberately. 2 pairs facing outward, 1 pair tucked behind. She liked the discipline of a pattern. Attention became a method of protection. There was a time when the cedar scent grew too persistent. It thickened like an exhalation, saturating the air not only when Sean was present, but in the stillness of early mornings and in the residual quiet after the party had emptied. It seemed to pool under the couch and linger in exactly the places where the camera files went white. Once, toward midnight, when the city had softened and the lamps had been left to their half-life, she noticed the underside of the couch exhale a shape in the half-light, a line of something that traced itself like an artisan drawing carefully and slowly. It felt attentive. It felt pleased by its own movements. The temperature of the air near it shifted to a marble coolness, and beneath that coolness there was a metallic sheen that was not the texture of skin. She had not, at first, wished to name anything. She had thought in terms of lapses and failures, of misfires in devices and the caprice of scent. But language falters when confronted with the wrongness of domestic certainties. She reached across the carpet, and her fingers met a scale of cold. The surface of it slick under her skin like a stone warmed in water. There was a pressure that closed gently around her fingertip. It was not the bite of threat. It was an exploratory hold, as if that appendage were reading the story of her through touch. It left a faint indentation, and the cedar smell intensified as if in approval. She recoiled with a quietness that surprised her. The phone in her lap showed no image. The camera on the tripod had refused to record. The house held its breath as if the building itself were conspiratorial. She blinked and saw Sean's shoes aligned at the entrance in a neat row. She pictured him leaving for another engagement, texting an excuse that would pass as inevitable. She imagined him at a donor's dinner later that evening, charming a small circle of people who would later insist there had been nothing amiss, that the photographs were fine, and that charm was a kind of currency they would not squander. Sean had always seemed skilled at choosing pleasance over complication. Where there was the smallest rupture, an awkward question, an inconvenient accusation, he offered a party or a joke, a curated appearance that invited forgetting. He was generous in public and discreet in private. His generosity purchased the gentleness of omission. It was a choice he made repeatedly. Let the music play, smooth the edges, move the eyes away. The first sighting made the choice visible in a way that was harder to ignore. He texted her later that night, asking if she had enjoyed the morning's brunch and including a photograph of a donor's grandson laughing. His messages were full of the small pleasures he could curate. New restaurants, a book he thought she would like, a single line about missing her. He avoided the awkwardness of the earlier exchange by substituting attention. He kept his life as easily photographed as a still life. He chose the world that rewarded him for performance. Ivy's ledger accumulated evidence the way a river gathers pebbles. She kept the white frames in a folder on her laptop. She printed the smudged photograph and clipped it to a page in her notebook. She wrote a line. 1 white frame, 3 smudges, 2 missing buttons. She dated it. She circled it. She put the thermos on the counter and poured coffee into a mug, warming her hands around the metal as if the heat could reassign courage. There were people who wanted tidy endpoints. They liked stories that culminated in consequences administered by systems with uniforms and paperwork. But Ivy had noticed that systems liked their narratives to be uncomplicated, and reputations, especially reputations that trafficked in charm, were overpriced in the economy of belief. She had already walked through the thin passage of institutional response and sensed the softness of the answers. Security could tell her what cameras had registered. The police could file a report. A technician could claim inexplicable corruption and offer a smiling invoice. None of that would necessarily make the cedar scent leave. None of that would necessarily close the space under the couch that exhaled a shape of patient intelligence. Something in Ivy recoiled from the idea of spectacle. She did not want a crowd to be the apparatus that proved her right. She did not want the house to become a stage. The thought of viral videos and parading officials felt like another kind of theft. the most intimate pieces of her life exposed and then explained away by a society that preferred moralizing explanations. She imagined people leaning in with their phones, calibrating their outrage into social capital, and the appendage withdrawing into a nest of half-truths. She decided instead to tend a different kind of defense. She began to practice what she could control. The angle of a mirror, the patient position of a lamp, the placement of shoes. She learned to move with the careful economy of someone who had to render the domestic world impenetrable without spectacle. Attention became a shield, but the world around her kept insisting on lightness. Sean's invitations continued in the polished way a man with social access arranges the weather. He texted a photograph of a donor's gala table set like a small kingdom and asked if she would accompany him, implying movement away from the house and its problems. People he knew bought his explanation for her unease before she had finished speaking it. Stress, friends would say over wine, collapsing the narrative into a tidy diagnosis. New surroundings, others suggested kindly. The house, they implied, had fixed luxuries that encouraged a softness of nerve. On a late evening, several weeks after the first white frame, Ivy sat alone on the sofa and rearranged the shoes by the mantel, a ritual that comforted. She had the cedar box under the hall mirror and the button wrapped inside like a taboo. The lamp by the armchair was on. Her phone lay clipped to the blanket on her lap. The couch curved around her like an attentive animal. The living room smelled of cedar and hot metal from the kettle she had turned off. She thought for a moment about calling her mother and then letting the call drop into the ease of silence. Something moved beneath the couch again. An undulation, a deliberate rotation of a line. This time Ivy did not reach for the phone. She reached instead for the lamp and angled its shade so that light spilled onto the couch like an accusation. The appendage paused, as if tasting the light, and then unfolded into the small clarity of a movement. Her breath thinned. This time, because she had practiced patience, she placed her hand on the carpet and extended a finger forward, as one might test the temperature of a pool. Contact met marble coolness. The surface was slick and faintly iridescent where the lamp's light caught it. When it curved around her finger, it was careful, exploratory, as if learning whether she was a thing to be catalogued, to be kept. The pressure was not violent. It pressed the skin just enough to leave a small impression, a circular ridge of warmth that stayed for a breath. And the cedar smell swelled as if to affirm a mutual recognition. There was no hiss, no voice, only the mute scrutiny of touch. Her fingertip tingled with a pressure that felt like being read. She could have screamed. She could have reached for the phone. Instead, she held still and let the moment compute itself. The appendage withdrew as quietly as it had emerged. No noise attended its retreat. It left under the couch the impression of its passing, like a small erosion of the carpet nap where something had partnered briefly with the fibers. It left the cedar trailing more insistently than before. She did not, in that moment, want spectacle. She did not want the house to become a laboratory for witnesses. She wanted to understand what attention could do, whether it could train her senses to hold a place of safety. She put the finger to her mouth as if tasting the memory, then warmed it with the heat of her breath. She wrote a line in the notebook. One tactile contact. Marble cool surface. Cedar intensification. She circled it. When she tried to show Kem the scene later that day, the tape looped to white right at the point where the lamp's pool would have shown something moving. Kem pinched the bridge of his nose and said, "It's like the system refuses to let that register." He checked the camera settings again. He ran a diagnostic. He opened the file in different software, and as he did, the screen washed into an unhelpful white that resolved into static complaint. "I can't explain it," he said. He meant it as consolation and as frustration. Sean's messages, meanwhile, multiplied in bucolic light. He scheduled dinners, curated an afternoon at a gallery, chose to be present in places where the lens loved him. He continued to prefer brightness. When she asked him, at one late hour, whether he had seen anything odd in the house, he answered with a charm that read like a refusal. "You're too imaginative tonight," he said, and then sent a photograph of a sunset as if color could reassign reality. He chose the realm of pleasure, the social circuits that rewarded his skill, over the private muddle of her unease. In the weeks that followed the tactile contact, Ivy shifted from expecting an institutional answer to recognizing the small armor of habits. She angled mirrors so she could see beneath the couch. She kept the lamp near that corner on at night and set the thermos on the table within arm's reach. She learned the rituals of domestic preemption, knowing the exact quarter turn of the lamp's dimmer that would reveal the appendage's shape without inviting the white blink into the camera. She left a pair of shoes out as a decoy and observed the slight disarrangement each morning. Small defenses felt like the only honest architecture left to her. At the same time, she watched Sean in public with a new clarity. He moved through rooms and crowds as if his life were a series of public transactions. A laugh here, a hand on a shoulder there, appearances calibrated like a series of scenes that reassured people they need not notice things they preferred not to. He chose, repeatedly, the path of curated delight. He cut short conversations about her anxieties with invitations to brunch or to small gallery openings, each gesture designed to keep people looking at surfaces. People who might otherwise ask uncomfortable things instead accepted the banality of gentleness, pleasure as a solvent for doubt. Her mother, when she spoke, returned to a theme of practical endurance. "You cannot rely on other people to name dangers you sense," she said. "You make your own plan." There was something clean in that austerity. Ivy found herself agreeing and resenting the simplicity simultaneously. She prepared a bag, passport, sweater, thermos, notebook, anything that would move her identity with her. She kept the cedar box under the mirror and left the lamp on. There is a particular cruelty in the way charm can flatten attention. A man practiced in public generosity can smooth away the edges of his private choices almost by force of presence. Sean's public life hummed like a machine that consumed skepticism and exhaled reputation. He would choose parties and curated appearances rather than private confession or inquiry. He would let the world of light and applause be his testimony. And yet the house remembered. It accumulated anomalies like a tarnish. The camera files, the smudged photos, the missing button. All these small signs formed an archive she could not admit to anyone without risking being drawn into the performance she distrusted. She did not want her life made into a spectacle she could not control. She preferred the slow work of retraining herself to notice. She learned to trust smell as a signature when other senses were denied. Cedar became a map of presence. Where it thickened, the world changed. Sometimes it arrived in the shape of a whisper, the way a scent lingers on a sleeve. Other times, it swelled into the room, as if a hand had poured a handful of wood chips into the air. It was less precise than a fingerprint and more intimate than a photograph. It spoke of someone's passing, like a line in a ledger. The days recomposed themselves into a practice of observation. Ivy developed a small taxonomy of the house's tendencies. The couch as partial concealment, the camera's white refusal, the cedar's timing. She wrote small lines in the notebook and left it open beside the thermos. She emailed the white frame files to Kem with careful subject lines. He responded with technical possibilities, power surge, sensor fault, but also with a promise to watch. Sean continued to choose the social theater. He texted invitations for dinners that would clink with crystal and laughter. He posted pictures of his latest philanthropic endeavor and was praised for his commitment. People who had already invested in his image found it easier to allow the white frames to remain unexplained. To ask too many questions was to break the contract of social ease. To look closely risked being the person who spoiled the party. Ivy found herself at the cusp of two inclinations. To make a spectacle that might force the world's hand, or to bury the evidence and learn to live guardedly. The idea of calling a press conference, of dragging the appendage into the daylight and demanding justice, felt like a possible victory and an ugliness at once. She did not want to convert the private terror of her nights into someone else's entertainment. She thought of how cruelty would perform under the gaze of many, and how the creature, if it was a creature, would react to being named. So she chose, for now, to keep her ledger private, and to increase the attention that could survive without witnesses. She practiced the arrangement of shoes, the opening of the cedar box, the steady use of a lamp. She left a camera in the living room with fresh batteries and a second on the hallway mirror, and she angled a third at the stairs landing to capture any movement that might move between rooms. She put the thermos on the coffee table, an anchor of warmth she could trust. In daylight, the house returned to its polished silence. The living room light slanted like a second skin. Sean texted a photograph of a donor circle smiling at his speech. He asked if she would be his +1 at an event the following weekend. He continued to make choices that preserved a world built on pleasantness. He chose parties over confession, curation over questions. He seemed, both to the people who watched and to himself, to prefer a life in which the imprecise things were smoothed away by the soft hand of social ritual. Ivy would not have used the word monster. She did not like the word's finality. Yet when she pressed her finger to the spot of the living room carpet where the appendage had explored, she felt the memory of the scale against skin, and understood that something in that house was not human in a way that mattered. There was a difference between being inhuman and being moral. The latter implied culpability, which complicated the picture further because Sean remained charming and carefully human in other ways. He was both more and less than the man his friends adored. She closed the cedar box and felt the hard line of the wood under her palm. For a moment she imagined setting the box on the mantel and walking past Sean at a party, letting him smile in public while the thing under the couch kept its patience. She imagined the moral economy of such a choice. He would continue to prefer the surface because it rewarded him, and she would be left to practice survival in small domestic movements. That night she wrote another entry in the leather notebook in neat, decisive strokes. 1 visual sighting, 1 tactile contact, 3 white frames, scent, cedar, intensified. She added a line, "Do not show the house to strangers." She underlined it. She made the list like a promise. Outside, the city was indifferent. Streetlights made small moons on the pavement, and taxis folded into noise. Inside, the lamps chose to keep their own rhythms. The cedar box slept under the mirror. The shoes remained arranged. The camera stood like a witness that refused to be definitive. Ivy, leaning against the back of the sofa with her legs tucked beneath her, felt the house breathe around her and understood, with an uneasy clarity, that the choice she was tracking, Sean's choice to keep pleasure as his main script, was itself a hazard. It was not only that he might be something else, it was that he had decided, again and again, to prefer the theater of charm to the labor of disclosure. If there was cruelty in omission, there was also a simple human economy at work. Acknowledgement would cost him something he did not want to spend. He would rather keep on being loved than risk being seen. So he kept smiling into cameras and arranging brief, gilded evenings. He texted and arranged and curated. He chose the pleasures that bought others silence. Ivy closed the notebook and put it back in the kitchen drawer next to the thermos. She left a lamp on in the hall. She placed the cedar box where the mirror could see it, and the reflection could be a second witness. She felt not heroic, but practical, the way one chooses to keep tiny fires lit because the dark seems less dangerous when there is light you can trust. When she went to bed that night, she left the door slightly ajar and the lamp on. She slept in a posture that was more alert than before. She counted the lamps. She kept one hand near the thermos on the table, another on the notebook. She did not wish for vindication so much as she wished for the muscles of attention to become reflexive. She imagined months of small adjustments, arranging shoes, angling mirrors, cataloging the cedar's permutations. She thought of the price she would pay for refusing spectacle, and the price she would pay for seeking it. She was tired of having to translate her nights for an audience that would prefer a story with neat endings. At 2 a.m. she woke and smelled cedar, oddly concentrated like a signature pressed to a page. She sat up and listened. The living room was a cut of light and shadow. Beneath the low band of the couch, an outline moved. She turned on the lamp nearest the doorway and leaned, heart kept small by practiced methods. The appendage emerged, deliberate and slow, and for an instant the room held its breath. She reached out, not with the phone, but with memory, with the ledger of all the small adjustments she had made. Her fingers brushed a cool, iridescent surface, and the cedar washed heavier, smelling like someone after a long journey home. The appendage pressed not in violence, but with an almost shy pressure, imprinting a circle on her finger that warmed like a coin under a lamp. For a second, she felt recognized, as if the thing read the ledger and found a name she could keep. The phone lay dark. The camera blinked to white in the memory of a file she could not restore. Outside, a city continued its indifferent hum. She slid the cedar box from under the mirror and opened it. Inside, the button she had wrapped in tissue was there, as if it had never left the tissue. She placed it back in and closed the lid. She put the box on the mantel and arranged the shoes neatly beneath it, as if setting a small order against the unruly world. He would go on choosing pleasure. She would go on learning to be attentive. The ledger sat open beside the thermos. She wrote another line and underlined it. Attention as armor. If you want to stay with a slow-burn tale like this, stay with us. The lamp hummed softly. The house remembered, and the lamp hummed softly. The house remembered, and Ivy let the memory of cedar fold into her palms like something brittle and valuable. For days the cedar lingered in the record of her life as if it were a watermark. It arrived in the small, uncanny clarities that had become her map. The trace of scent on a sleeve, the way a mirror retained a fractionally delayed gesture, the smear on a print that no cleaning could coax away. She found herself moving through rooms with the economy of a person who had learned to measure minutes as if they were tools. She learned which lights dulled the camera's appetite for white. She learned which mirror angles offered the clearest view beneath furniture. She learned the quarter turn of a dimmer that let shape remain without inviting the blink. Sean continued to perform his chosen life. He chose it with the deliberateness of someone who has watched what applause does to people. Invitations proliferated like a favored scent. Brunches with donors, gallery openings, a small dinner for a visiting patron. He wrapped attention in small luxuries and handed them to people as if he had discovered pleasure on their behalf. When she saw him in public, he moved through space like an accomplished illusionist. Hands in the right places, laughter measured so it would fall generously on those nearest, the cedar faintly present as if he had carried a woodpile in the lining of his coat. Ivy went to one of his larger evenings because it felt impossible not to. Attendance, she had learned, buys perspective. To watch him in the theater for which he had chosen himself was to see how he translated private admission into public currency. The event was held in a repurposed warehouse, white walls, generous light, a bar that took names like pledges. Guests clustered in small islands, each one orbiting some shared taste. Sean moved through them, an easy light on his face. He paused to congratulate a curator, to clasp an old acquaintance's shoulder, to pose for a photograph with the mayor, smiling in a way that made the camera love him. She leaned against a pillar and watched. The cedar was there in her nostrils like a punctuation, but subtle, woven into his coat the way wood is woven into a table. She had a small camera tucked in her palm, a discreet thing that fit into the crook of a hand like an apology. She thought of the appendage, of the cool scale pressed against her fingertip under the couch, and she thought of the white frames collected in a folder on her laptop. She thought, dangerously, of exposure, not for spectacle but as a test, if the world would even notice. When Sean stepped away from the crowd to answer a phone, his overcoat threaded through his arm, she moved closer. He paused beneath a skylight to finish his call, the light making a soft halo at his collar. For one heartbeat, she saw the contour she had learned to recognize. A curve at the small of his back where fabric did not sit flat. A suggestion of line beneath the cloth that caught the gallery light with a metallic sheen. It was small, like a detail added to a sculpture. It was, in her bones, familiar. She raised the camera with practiced discretion and pressed the shutter. At that instant, a fluke of light, of timing, someone triggered a flash from the other side of the room. Not the careful shutter of her compact, but a professional burst from a large camera. The flash lanced the space into brilliant white, and for a second, every surface refused to show edges. Her camera recorded a frame full of honest, burning light, where the curve of scale should have been. The file in her pocket later resolved into a white rectangle at the one moment she had thought truth might be captured. She lowered the device and watched Sean finish his call. He turned and smiled, and as he did, he shrugged his coat more easily onto his shoulders, as if to settle into the safety of movement. He did not catch the way her face had changed. He did not need to. His world rewarded him with the small economies of denial. An audience that preferred to be amused, a press that liked clean compositions, friends who mistook charm for confession. After the gala, he sent a note. Delighted, exquisite night. Would she join him at a small dinner the following week? His language was full of immediate pleasures, menus, friends to meet, a new chef he thought she would like. He asked about the house with a practiced casualness that avoided the unmanageable things. He did not, in his messages, propose conversation about the oddities she had catalogued. He offered instead the balm of movement, Let us be somewhere else where light is flatter and people are kind. Outside the gallery the city felt thinner, as if the night itself was being hemmed into a shape of ease. She stood for a long moment and smelled cedar in the cool air. A distant scent like a secret left behind. She had wanted a frame the world could not refuse. She had only received the banal economy of a white photograph, and the knowledge that public light could be weaponized by chance. She texted Kim, came close. Blank. He wrote back, keep it small. He did not say what she suspected, that in a world keen to be comforted, blanks will be read as convenient. The social currents pushed against her at every turn. Friends who had once laughed at small eccentricities now positioned themselves so curiosity would not be their fault. Maybe it's a camera glitch, a neighbor offered, tapping the screen of a phone that would not reveal anything. Stress, someone else said, their voice soft, as if to neutralize what was awkward with the force of compassion. The economy of being beloved by society exacted a toll. To be the person who insists on the difficulty of a charm is to risk being the person who breaks the party. After the gala, she resolved to keep the ledger private, but she also wanted distance. She began to inventory less like an investigator and more like a person preparing to make a long, careful exit if it ever became necessary. She packed a small bag the way her mother had suggested. Passport, sweater, thermos, the leather notebook. She left the cedar box visible under the mirror and, in a private ritual, set a button she suspected she would lose again into its tissue. Weeks condensed in the pattern she had learned. Small rituals, public pleasures, private frictions. The cedar signature showed up in places that made no sense. On an umbrella left leaning against a stairwell, in an elevator press of air, on a theater seat after a matinee. Sometimes it came as a wash, a heavy punctuation on the edge of a conversation. Once she found it tucked into the collar of a coat she'd lent to a friend. A discreet, impossible gift. Each time it arrived, she felt the ledger grow heavier. On a thin, overcast afternoon, she received a message from Sean, asking her to accompany him to a charity barbecue at the country club. He had chosen the event for its gentleness. Grilled food, owner-approved conversation, a trampoline of casual philanthropy where reputations could be polished with picnics. She thought of refusing. She thought of the ways his world smoothed difficulty into a pleasant surface. In the end, she went because refusal felt like giving him a province of herself. Why cede the field she had been trying to hold? The barbecue was all the things he liked to show. Laughter arranged, food in columns, a small stage with a whispered speech. People clustered and practiced small intimacies. Sean rode through the crowd like a beneficial rumor, pausing to listen, to offer a plate, to kiss cheeks. He had the sort of public generosity that made people lean in and forget that they were being led in any particular direction. She watched him from a bench beneath a maple. The cedar lingered like a film on the air near him. At one point he crouched to examine a child's drawing with an attentiveness that was almost comically perfect. He smiled at the parents, and the crowd exhaled in relief. She thought, absurdly, of the way a man can choose the comfort of being loved rather than the cost of being accountable. After a while she rose and wandered toward the periphery of the event. The park's edge gave onto a low lane where service vehicles clustered. She noticed Sean's car near the curb, a neat black thing. Through its rear window she glimpsed an angle of coat folding. A small, slow line of metallic sheen caught the light as if someone had affixed a subtle ornament to the fabric. Her chest tightened. She moved closer, steps quiet in grass. A child bumped her elbow then, accidental, and a camera clicked in the main tent. A chorus of cheap shutters and phone flashes. She looked through the glass of the car at the small of Sean's back as he shrugged a coat over his shoulders, and for a fraction of a second saw perfectly the curve of something iridescent at the seam of his jacket. It was a private structural thing, the kind of smallness she had learned to read. She moved to take a photograph with the little camera she kept in her bag. At the same moment someone at the tent laughed loudly, and a floodlight activated to illuminate the stage. The light bloomed like white paint. Her camera, already tilted, recorded a frame washed into honest, blinding white. Out of the corner of her eye she watched Sean turn and wave. The crowd waved back. The moment was gone into the same pure nothing that had become a kind of language in that house. She stood with the camera useless in her hands, and felt the familiar spike of solitude. It was not only that proof refused her. It was the way the universe seemed to have arranged itself to accommodate certain kinds of erasures. Erasure dressed up as performance, as happenstance, as the unavoidable randomness of light. She lowered the device and walked away from the car, leaving the cedar in the air like a trace that refused to resolve. Later that night, she found the button missing from the cedar box. She did not shout. There was no theatrical collapse. She sat at the kitchen table, the thermos steaming faintly at her elbow, and wrote a line. Button. Missing. She circled it twice. She placed the box back under the mirror, and left the lamp on in the hall. The absence felt like an answer of sorts. The world would not give her something so small without exacting a price. Sean's life continued to be a study in chosen brightness. He called the following week with offers of concerts and previews. He peppered his messages with photographs that showed him at great tables, laughing in a halo of applause. In each frame he looked more assured. His public life did not require the messy labor of confession. He preferred instead the economy of what James called pleasure as maintenance, tending to the impression that the world gave him attention, and allowing that attention to smooth any deficiencies. He had chosen to live largely in the banked warmth of other people's goodwill. For a time, Ivy considered leaving the city. She imagined a house in a smaller town where light did not behave like a witness, and where the cedar scent would perhaps be less freighted with significance. She tried packing again, an exercise this time in rehearsal. But she found herself hesitating over small objects. The notebook, the thermos Kem had gifted, the cedar box under the mirror. Each item felt like a tether to a version of her life she was not yet ready to foreclose. The next notable rupture came not in public, but in the familiarity of the nights when attention is thinnest. One rain-splattered evening, after a day of routine adjustments, mirror angled, lamp left burning low, shoes arranged, she returned from a late errand to find the living room as she had left it, and yet not. A smudged photograph lay on the coffee table, curling at one corner as if it had been recently handled. She picked it up. It was a shot from the barbecue. A crowd of smiling faces, and in the lower edge a wash of gray that the photographer's software had shrugged into an innocuous blur. She did not know whether someone had substituted it, whether her paranoia had threaded itself into an action taken on her behalf, or whether the world had decided to pull a small sleight of hand. Her hands moved as if by habit. She checked the camera on the tripod. The recording from the previous night. Nothing but a white frame at the moment when the living room had intimated movement. The metadata showed no obvious anomaly. Voltage stable, file intact until the blank. Kem frowned at the screen and said, "It's like a thing that chooses not to register." He offered again to set up additional devices, to run a continuous feed that might circumvent whatever refusal the sensors enacted. He meant it kindly. He meant to make it practical. She refused. "Why?" Kem asked, bewildered and patient. "You're asking me to believe this on faith, and that's not. You don't want faith. You want something that bolts to the door." Ivy looked at him and said simply, "I don't want to build a circus." He put his hand on her shoulder, an old gesture of a friend. He did not press. "Then we keep the lights on, and we try to be strategic," he said. "We make the house less hospitable to things that prefer dark corners." She accepted the compromise. More lamps, better placed mirrors, a camera with a redundant feed that no single surge could erase. She placed it carefully and asked him to leave a thermos on the counter, as he did when he left a house he wanted to secure. He laughed once, tired, and left. If there was a particular cruelty to Sean's choice, it was not only the evasion itself, but the way it rerouted consequences into someone else's landscape. Where a man of conscience might have paused to consider what his life had cost another person, time, attention, the right to sleep, Sean arranged presence to look like kindness. He would be generous in small, legible ways, and then step away from the awkwardness of private accountability, as if the two were mutually exclusive. He did not do malevolence. He did omission, which can be more corrosive. There was, in this period, a steady accretion of minor defeats. The camera would record white at the edge of the couch, and then performably resume as if nothing had happened. A button would vanish and reappear in a place that made no sense. Neighbors would say, without ill will, that perhaps she needed rest. A friend at an event would murmur, "People have secrets. Let them be." Their voices were not cruel, but they reinforced a social inertia that made noticing an act of bravery. She kept practicing small habits. Attention as armor, she wrote in the notebook and underlined it. She learned the choreography of a house that asked for attention instead of witnesses. A lamp dialed to a certain light, 2 spare keys hidden in a cassette under the sink, shoes placed for the exact optical line a mirror provided. She grew accustomed to the house's vocabulary of small protections. It was not heroic in its scale, but it was thorough. One week, as winter coalesced into a thin and persistent cold, she received an invitation to a private supper Sean was hosting for a benefactors' circle. To decline seemed to concede a territory to him. To go was to allow herself to be seen where he preferred to be loved. For reasons she could not fully explain, curiosity, stubbornness, the desire to see him in a roomful of reliance, she attended. It was, like many of his gatherings, impeccably staged. Candles guttered in low cairns, napkins folded in a way that seemed casual and exact at once, a selection of wines that claimed knowledge without arrogance. Guests clustered in subgroups, each performing the practiced intimacy of people who moved in certain circles. Sean, as ever, worked the room like a relief, smiling in the right places, apologizing for a joke, referring to a mutual acquaintance by name. His gestures were the perfect instruments of forgiveness. Halfway through the evening, she stepped outside to the narrow garden that abutted the dining room, a walled pocket of air where service staff kept a spare supply of cedar chips for the smokers who came to stand under the lampposts. It smelled faintly of wood and ash. The city beyond was distant as a rumor. She stood and breathed the air and found the cedar there as if it had followed her. He found her there a moment later, offering an arm and the map of his attention. For a second she considered telling him everything. The white frames, the tactile memory, the steady refusal of the world to corroborate her. She began, carefully, and then stopped. She had learned, painfully, that speech could be smoothed into a kind of erasure by a man practiced in public charm. It threaded into the same pattern. Tell, be doubted. Watch, as the world curates the disbelief away. He took her hand, an easy motion, and said softly, "You look tired." He offered a cigarette he did not light, instead keeping the matchbox as an accessory for his hands. She watched the small of his back as he moved. The curve she had seen in a dozen frames afterward read as nothing in the social light. He was, for reasons he understood and she did not fully share, choosing pleasure. "What would you do," she asked then, looking at him plainly, "if I told you the house remembers things you don't want it to?" He considered the question the way a man might consider a menu, an idea to be sampled and then set aside. He put his thumb against the edge of a matchbook and said, "I would help you find better sleep." The answer was perfunctory and kind in the way a practiced man is kind when he chooses the smallest labor. It was help, but not the kind that required him to step into the unpleasantries of action. She left the supper early. On the way out, she felt the shift old friends had taught her to read. A man who will not be inconvenienced by the moral cost of omission will prefer to trade away accountability for an evening of applause. He could choose to be loved rather than be honest. It was a transactional decision, and, like all transactions, it had its price. That night, in the quiet of her living room, she experienced a new kind of clarity. There would be no unraveling of the social theater in her favor. The public would not conspire to produce a neat end. The cameras would fail at the moments she most needed them. Reputations would be defended with soft smiles and precise gestures. If she sought vindication in the world at large, she might find herself dragged across stages she did not want to stand on. She decided instead on maintenance, on the patient rituals that kept a house stable. She would not invite spectacle into a life already scorched by exposure. She would not publicly accuse a man who thrived on the currency of others' pleasure. She would, in the small domain she could control, practice survival. Her days became a slow knitting together of domestic certainties. She mapped the house as if it were a small country with borders she must patrol. She placed mirrors at calculated axes, so that the area beneath the couch could be seen in 3 different planes at once. She kept a redoubling of battery packs for the camera, and tucked the thermos in a place where her hand could reach without thinking. She began to sleep with the hall lamp on and the bedroom door slightly cracked so that sound could not be entirely smothered. She rubbed her finger along the cedar box at least 3 times a day, like a small benediction. She learned, too, how to speak less and listen more to the life the house kept telling her. In the beginning, she had wanted names, a taxonomy, a public pronouncement that would end the labor of being vigilant. Over time, she discovered that naming sometimes reduces what is wild into something you can neatly tie off. Supervision becomes a cage when it is built of other people's doubts. She preferred the vigilance that was practical, private, and slow. There came, finally, a night that felt like a hinge. It was a rainy evening. The city glassed over and the lamps pooled like wet coins on the pavement. She had not seen Sean for some nights. He had been away at a donor's retreat, message after message promising a return soon. She was alone in a way that tightened her chest, but also sharpened her senses. At midnight she rose to check the lamp near the couch, a ritual she had settled into like an old habit. The living room smelled faintly of cedar, though no one had been there. She angled the mirror to the exact place beneath the sofa, and left the lamp at the quarter dim she had learned to watch with. For a moment there was nothing but the rhythm of the heating and the distant hum of rain. Then the line emerged. It was deliberate and small, the movement of something practiced. The appendage, if that was a useful shorthand, unfolded into the room as if it were seeking consent. It was a shallow, patient curiosity, the same touch she had felt months before, but now more confident, as if whatever it was had learned the rhythms of the house as well as she had. The surface flashed with a faint iridescence in the lamplight. It smelled of cedar, and something colder beneath it, a mineral tone like riverstone. It moved with the slow intelligence of something that knew the measure of furniture and the angle of truth. She extended a hand without thinking. The contact this time was different, broader, as if it were testing the gender of the world. It wrapped not just a fingertip, but the side of her hand in a gentle, cool pressure that sketched a circle along the skin and left an imprint like a memory warmed into flesh. The sensation carried no cruelty. It carried the neutral curiosity of an entity cataloging a new variable. She closed her eyes and let the touch pass over her like a reading. When the appendage withdrew, the cedar swelled behind it like a phrase that awaited punctuation. At her elbow, the camera on the tripod clicked a good, practical frame and then resolved, white, exactly where motion would have been. The world, as if on a script, refused the image that would have made the encounter literal. She did not gasp. She did not call the police or the press. She returned to the notebook and wrote, "One late-night contact, broader pressure, cedar intensified, camera white." She circled the entry, then underlined, "Attention as armor." Outside, traffic moved through puddled streets, and someone laughed in a car passing by. The city kept its indifferent rhythm. Inside, the house kept its particular conversation with things that did not entirely belong to the world. She rose and took the cedar box from beneath the mirror, feeling the warm lacquer under her palm, and put it on the mantel where a mirror would always see it. She arranged a pair of shoes neatly beneath it, a small ritual line against the possibility of disorder. There was a simplicity in her decision, a merciful pragmatism. She would not force the world to make a spectacle of something it preferred not to see. She would not ask strangers to translate the house's small language into the blunt grammar of headlines and hashtags. Instead, she would keep her ledger, keep her light, and keep the cedar box as a private evidence of attention. She would not chase spectacle. She would live precisely. In the morning she read a brief item in a society column. Sean had been seen at a breakfast with the new councilwoman. Photos were flattering, smiles abundant. The usual small economies of charm unfolded in neat sentences. He had, as ever, the world on a short leash of applause. He had chosen, again, to keep the theater of pleasure as his means of being known. She did not expect apology. She did not expect really anything from him at all. She had learned to read his choices as a kind of economy, spend the capital of intimacy on appearances, hoard reputation against the cost of private labor. He had chosen the world that rewarded him for being untroubled. She chose not to be the person whose life was consumed by a demand for public proof. In that choice, there was a grief, and also an odd relief. Her life could no longer rely on somebody else's willingness to tell the truth. She would, instead, teach herself a set of disciplines that would allow her to continue with some dignity. The house would be a place of careful living, not a stage of exposure. The final days of the winter that year were a study in small domestic heroics. She learned to move like someone who never wanted to be surprised by the underside of things. She kept a lamp lit by the couch always, the heat coiling into the room like a constant currency. She placed mirrors in triangulation so that if something threaded the floor it would be seen from one of 3 angles. She kept the cedar box on the mantel in a place that was visible and private all at once. She placed the thermos where her hand could find it in the dark, and she lived. She took walks that were strategic, always noting exits, always carrying the notebook in a pocket. She met friends for coffee, and did not overshare. Kem came on Sunday mornings and brewed a pot of coffee, and they talked about less heavy things, the new refrigerator filter he had installed, the groceries the neighborhood would favor. Her mother called, and they spoke in code sometimes about how to make a bag, whether the passport was where it should be. Small banalities became the scaffolding of a life built to endure. Sean continued his circuit of pleasures. He hosted and was delightful. He was photographed and praised. His life kept accruing the sorts of soft economies that make social capital. It could be argued, not unfairly, that he did not have to know the exact moral architecture of his choices. He might never be asked to pay a price he deemed reasonable. He would, in the end, count the votes of what the world thought of him and find them sufficient. The last scene, if it could be called that, was not a revelation, but a steadying departure. One bright Sunday she packed a small bag with the things that fit her life. The thermos, the notebook, the cedar box. She left the house not as a renunciation, but as a repositioning. She did not advertise the decision. She left a note for Kem that said, "Going away for a little while." No panic. She set the mirrors to the angles she had always used, left a lamp on a thin dim, and slid the cedar box into the bag, feeling the weight of it like a small, honest heart. She walked past the apartment where Sean had hosted the gala, past the corner where the barbecue had been. The city smelled of rain and fried food, the kind of complex of odors that makes memory both precise and forgiving. At a crosswalk she stopped and looked back, because she would be untrue to herself if she did not let himself be seen at least once. Through a window she saw him moving among people, offering a drink, laughing with the easy facility of someone who had chosen pleasure as professional advantage. He had chosen that world. He had chosen it over the labor of accounting for his private omissions. It was his economy, and he would spend it as he chose. She turned from the window and continued down the street. The cedar followed her for a block like a fugitive note. Then it thinned. She felt neither triumph nor defeat. She felt the simple, kinetic truth of a life rerouted, attention as armor, not as accusation, survival as a disciplined practice. On the train, she opened the cedar box and looked at the button wrapped in tissue. It was small and ordinary, and, in some ways, the last possible evidence she would carry. She placed it back and closed the lid. She made a list in the notebook of the things she would need in the new place, not as inventory but as a pact: lamp, 2 mirrors, thermos, cedar box, notebook. She underlined attention. As the city fell into stripe and clap behind the train's windows, she thought of him. The man who chose pleasures that the world could applaud over the unpleasantries of truth. She thought of the appendage, of the way it had tested her like an instrument of curiosity, of the cedar that would always be a map she could trust. She thought of the many people who would prefer to keep their lives uncomplicated, and the cost their choices exacted upon others. She did not want the world to make a spectacle of what she had learned in quiet. She wanted to learn endurance. When she stepped off the train, she walked for a long time through a neighborhood that smelled of baking bread. She found a small room for rent above a bookshop and took it. It was not luxury, but it would be hers. She placed the cedar box on a shelf above the sink and left a lamp on through the night. She kept the mirror angled, so the small of the bed could be seen from the doorway. She left her shoes in a pattern she had invented for security and peace. Each gesture was an insistence. Months later, a friend sent an article clipped from an online magazine. Sean had been photographed at an opening wearing a new overcoat. Comments praised his warmth and elegance. He had, the piece said, continued his philanthropic work with grace and generosity. The caption's photographs were clean. In none of them did the cameras record what Ivy would have called appendage. The world had, as it will, continued to favor surface over uncomfortable interiorities. She read the article and folded it into the notebook beside the entries. 1 visual sighting, 1 tactile contact, 3 white frames. She closed the book and set the thermos on the counter. She did not feel triumphant. She felt instead that slow, resolute steadiness of someone who has learned to live with a knowledge that cannot be proved. There was a clarity in that steadiness. The choice between lit stages and trained attention was not a simple moral dividing line, but an economy of survival. Some people will choose to be loved for their public persona. Others will choose to rearrange their lives to keep what is private intact. There is no dramatis personae of absolutes. There are, instead, human beings making decisions that ripple outward. On a late afternoon when light lay soft across the room, she opened the cedar box and uncapped the thermos. She set a lamp so that its light touched the place beneath the couch. The mirror at the hall caught the reflection like a secondary witness. She breathed in cedar for the comfort it offered, and sat down at the small table to write. Her last line that evening read like a small, careful verdict, neither a sentence of triumph nor an elegy. She underlined it twice and closed the notebook. He chose pleasure over reality. He wasn't human. If this kind of slow-burn, uncanny story sits with you, stay with us and subscribe for more quiet tales that dwell on the spaces between attention and denial.